One day you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narrative, where truth lives.
And hello, everybody. It's so good to be back with you on a brand new season of Narrative Live. We've been looking forward to returning, and it is a good show tonight. Eric Garland is back with us. Eric, it's so good you're doing yet another season here. How are you doing, Eric?
Glad to be back. Plenty going on. Let's get it on.
Did you like the voiceover, the little voiceover at the beginning there?
I did.
Yeah, it's quite cute. You know, sometimes people listen to the show. They don't watch the show, so they need to hear what's going on. So lots of other big news happening today. Of course, you can't talk about today without talking about the news of the Queen passing. Queen Elizabeth II, of course, passing today after what seems to be a recent illness, but an easy illness in terms of the fact that she didn't suffer too long, and she went probably in the best way you could ask, at her favorite place in Balmoral, where she was always very comfortable. She was comfortable when she passed away, and she was 96, so she had a good run. Yeah, not bad.
She was queen over more than 1/3 of the existence of America.
Yes, that's a good point. It's actually very valid and very important that people stress this thing, because think about the longevity of this reign. I mean, it's so vast, it's so monstrous that she was, how many 13 American presidents passed through that period of time. It shows you how limited power, the American president has compared to someone who survives, in power for that long. But not only her surviving, it's an entire dynasty surviving for centuries, obviously, and through that time they've been able to amass an enormous amount of wealth, an enormous amount of influence, an enormous amount of power. So people who say they view this as sort of a ceremonial position, that the Queen is sort of a ceremonial figure, I don't think that's the case. I think she presides over a massive, well, she presided, and the King will now preside over a massive empire still, even though it might be, she's not in complete total control of each part of the empire. She has enormous influence in each part of it.
I mean, the Anglo, the British Empire, its demise was perhaps exaggerated, or the description of its demise. In some way, it with the Aus UK or AUKUS, as it said, the military alliance of the United States, of the UK, and of Australia. The British Empire is as powerful as it's ever been in many regards. It's maintained its distance from the European Union. It quite wisely, I think, made sure it didn't get involved in the euro currency, and has maintained independence over its banking, insofar as you don't count all the Russian, Saudi, Chinese, and Qatari money that tends to gum up some of the works there. But that's nothing you can't say about Wall Street. So we're all in the same boat there. But in the years since Trump, and in the years since, all of democracy has been under attack from illiberal forces, it's really the UK and the United States that has reemerged as probably the most important partnership in all of geopolitics. And, you can't consider that fact and then not consider the role of the crown in this, and not consider the role of the monarch that just passed and the one that's to come up. So this is a very important day and a very important shift.
It's very well said. And of course, it was her, it must be her great 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 grandfather was George III, the one that America sort of ran away from, or became dependent in reaction to. It doesn't feel to me like that relationship got that much weaker. They're still very powerful, close allies, America and Great Britain, and the Queen still has a lot of influence.
Weaker between us and them, because we've had some different relationships. There's been 6 monarchs between George III and Queen Elizabeth II. So there's been for Americans it's a long time, and you could say in 1812 when they burned the White House that our relations were at a nadir, a trend, a dip. We were a bit
Canadians
out of sorts.
think they did that too, by the way. But anyhow, everyone lays claim to that.
Burning the White House?
Yes, it was Canadians. It was the Canadians, but the British, of course, right?
Yeah, we called them the British back then. But there was some interest about whether the British were going to enter on the side of the Confederacy to split up the United States in the mid 19th century. In fact, I remember a woman in France I met who was from the UK, and she says to me, "Eric, do you think the Southerners are upset with Britain for not having intervened on their side in the Civil War?" This would have been about 1996. I'd have been a young man, and I was sort of perplexed by this question. And I think I responded, "I believe many people in the South of the United States are aware that there is a country called England and that it was around during the Civil War. But I don't think they harbor any ill will that you did not jump in on their side. Perhaps back then there was that expectation, but I think they're still cranky with us up north. But anyhow,
that's interesting digression. But it's I think a lot about like Uncle Sam and that whole influx of resources that came to make America. A lot of those resources did actually come from the crown. I mean, even though the crown was aware that they were separating, they also funded a lot of the independent militia, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they had some sort of back channel way of also influencing the independence movement.
Well, I mean, the soldiers that fought, King George's army had just recently been King George's army.
Right.
The French and Indian War had not. In fact, that's where a lot of the tension was over. Is that who we now call the Americans, fought the French because we were a lot of people considered themselves Englishmen still, especially where I'm from in New England, and that cost a lot of money to fight the French and kick them on the plains of Abraham out of what's now known as Quebec. That cost a lot of money, which caused the Brits to raise taxes all over, including in the colonies where the colonials weren't necessarily all English subjects or hadn't been in a long time and didn't necessarily have a lot of patience or loyalty, and they didn't have any representation. And that's what caused a lot of those tensions. So yeah, the Brits, because we were the Brits, they funded a lot of us. So
we all still wanted the same thing. We sort of had an inter-family fight. It sort of feels like, which leads us back to the new guy, the King Charles III. I'm going to take a long time to get used to saying King Charles III.
The new guy who we have all known our entire lives.
Yeah. So the new guy's in charge now, and he has interesting ideas about things. He's very outspoken about sustainable economies and about de-emphasizing globalization. He's good friends with Donald Trump. They seem to get along pretty well. That was always an interesting. When Trump and Melania were there on a state visit, Charles and Trump went on this separate little hike together, and they're pretty chummy. I think they might share some opinions on some things like race, but and who knows how influential that could be in the upcoming elections. But he's a very stodgy guy. He's by all accounts quite racist, which of course is no surprise to anybody. But he's got a dark past as well, and he's an old guy, but he's very approachable. Apparently he can he's easy to talk to and has some good ideas on the environment and sustainable economy. So that might be an interesting thing as he tries to implement some of that across the empire that he still has, even though he only has a limited amount of time.
Well, we all have a limited amount of time. Either way, I mean, this is a fascinating point in history where you have in the same week a new head of government and a new head of state in the United Kingdom at the same time. And, Liz Truss, who's the new prime minister, doesn't seem to be a remarkably more liberal direction than her predecessor. In fact, some things may seem to be more intensely like they were under Boris Johnson, to the point that I wonder how long that will last. But there is a new monarch, and I think if there's anything if there's any illusion we've come to be disabused of, it's that the royals don't have an influence or a significant influence one way or the other, whether it's arms trafficking or back channeling to Putin, like the Queen's cousin, Michael.
Yeah,
I think it was.
Michael is. Yeah, I think the whole family is related to the Romanovs. I think they've got a close relationship. Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. King George and Kaiser Wilhelm and Alexander. The thing is Alexander. Anyways, they all had the same grandmother, Queen Vic.
Yeah, there's only one family. There's only one big royal family, and they all sort of split up a little along the way. Now, it's interesting that King Charles is going to be a little bit different in some ways, because his whole approach is a far more insider kind of approach. He's been involved in a scandal where he's been writing to British ministers in the cabinet. We've seen some of those notes. Those were not just like, hey, nice to see you at the latest fundraiser. It was, I don't like what you're doing with this law, and I'd like you to change that law. So he's been very involved in government, even up until now. So there was that scandal. And I'm sure now that he's got an amenable prime minister to work with, he'll be running things. I don't think we should expect that this king is going to not be running things. In a world where autocrats are back and monarchists are back, Prince Charles would be foolish, or King Charles would be foolish, not to try, get the reins of power and control things on a day-to-day basis. I would not be surprised if he does that.
Well, I mean, I would imagine in my conversations with Brits, they in general, I know a lot of people who cherish the monarchy as an institution and bristle at the notion of the monarchy as having a day-to-day political effect. And many will argue that Americans are badly mistaken that they can put that kind of pressure on their democratic governance there. That said, when you're tossing around billions and billions of pounds sterling as the royal family is able to, and you are able to back channel to every form of power that there is on the planet, that's probably, that maybe underappreciate the role that those people can.
And also the king and the queen have a weekly meeting with the prime minister. It's a very secretive meeting. I mean, we don't really know what goes on there, but they have a weekly meeting. That's that's a regular meeting where they discuss all the affairs of state. And the queen reportedly was very up to speed with everything that was going on. So, sure, the king will be the same. I mean, there's no reason to expect otherwise. And, I guess if the king or the queen ask you to do something and you're the prime minister, if you want that knighthood, or you want that title at the end of your career, then you may want to agree with them on certain things,
Now, when the audience is done with not only this podcast and this episode of Narrative and the next 5 that they really need to explore, they should check out some of the videos of CGP Grey on YouTube about the British Crown and the structure of the British Empire. Very entertaining, and it explains in great detail the intricacies of the crown dependencies, the territories, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, all the different definitions. And I think it would be scintillating for the audience if they like narrative, because there is no institution like the British Empire. Nothing and all of its, everything from the fact that King Charles is now, unless possibly the Japanese emperor might be this way too, but the Japanese emperor has a very different relationship to the national government. I believe the only head of state who is anointed by God, and as the head of the King of England, or the Anglican Church, he is directly appointed by the Almighty, which is a neat thing to put on LinkedIn. By the way.
Yeah. Appointed by the Almighty, can commit any crimes, and he's inheritor of a lot of mob laundered money. So why not? And Saudi
It's
money.
good to be the king.
It's good to
all
be the
around.
king. And
Yeah,
it sure is. And this is the future of the monarchy. William will be next after Charles, and then that is little Prince George. Not so little anymore.
Wow.
Well, he's up next after William. So he has a very unique look. I kind of enjoy that. So he'll be next, and this is probably the last portrait they took together in terms of the succession line. But that's interesting. Yeah,
I mean, I do not think of it as I know, like you and I were talking about before the show, Zev, Americans tend to be fascinated with the royal family from a distance, not with the same affection that Australians, Kiwis, Canadians, and the British themselves might have, but are generally fascinated. But again, geopolitically, the sharing of nuclear submarine technology and the integration of intelligence systems, the AUKUS alliance is the most important alliance that's formed up.
Yeah.
And really, for those who aren't geopolitics nerds, NATO's important, but we need to remember that NATO has been, has been not infiltrated, but some of the countries that comprise NATO, such as Hungary and
Turkey.
Yeah. We've had some complexities there. And, it's funny. It wasn't until the Ukrainian war here that Vladimir Putin started that we, see these NATO countries giving Ukraine weaponry, and it's Soviet weaponry. It's like S-300, it's MiG airplanes, it's S-300 missile batteries. That's not U.S. gear. That's not NATO, otherwise NATO compliant gear. So it's interesting that we managed to empty all that out, and no doubt they'll be ordering more from British and American defense contractors to fill the backfill.
Of course, which
Thanks,
we'll pay
Vladimir.
for.
That was a great strategic positioning you just gave us.
But back to AUKUS, that's what you're saying is that AUKUS is the most pivotal of the alliances, and really it will be King Charles that will be at the helm of that. I mean, when you really think about it, I mean, sure, each country has their own contribution, but because they also are the Australians and then New Zealand, and I think Canada's not part of it actually, but Australia and New Zealand are the other parts of it. You can see how they would be. Am I correct?
It's the part of NATO that counterbalances China, which we're here to talk about tonight. So
good segue.
Good segue. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, yes, because we did forget to mention at the top of the show, tonight is the premiere of our embedded serial called The Dragon's Tail. I called it The Dragon's Tail because I was thinking about the Wag the Dog, which is remember Wag the Dog?
I do.
Yeah, the scenario where the dog, where you start a war in order to win a position of power in a certain situation. So The Dragon's Tail is sort of a version of that, where you've got China behind the scenes, creating a series of events that seem to have been centered around destroying American democracy. And we'll go into detail about that in just a few minutes. But because it just happened today, I think we should talk a little bit about Steve Bannon and his relationship to China, because this man is in a whole lot of hot water because he's finally facing a judge on the issue of the Build the Wall Foundation, or whatever it is they called it, which was, do you remember much about the story? Can you tell people about the story at all? I can tell them, but I think you might.
The Build the Wall, they set up I don't know all the financial details, like where the money went per se, but they set up a fake charity that took money from unsuspecting donors, and no doubt the money laundering accounts of a few hostile intelligence services into Bannon and others' coffers, ostensibly under some massive construction project between Brownsville, Texas, and San Diego, which is actually quite a long way. It should be of no surprise to anybody that they didn't actually build a wall, but they did actually take the money.
Yeah, he took about $1 million. I think Bannon did himself, just $1 million in personal expenses from that. From MAGA.
Yeah, and when you think of all the operatives that may have paid, and and I don't know the source of all the money, and I don't know of the expenditures of all the money. However, when you get some basic definitions that are delineated in statutes, criminal statutes, such as, did you engage constructive fraud to tell people you were going to do one thing and then you did another? Did you take that money and put it into another, financial institution or set of bank accounts? And did you make it pop out somewhere else where you obscured the origin of that money? Well, that's money laundering, and that's against the law. And we may never get a look for reasons of sources and methods and other intelligency and counterintelligency kinds of things. We may never know all those details, but we know that he was charged federally, and then Trump pardoned him, and now New York has charged him again because it's also against the law in New York. So.
And they are really going after him. I mean, I think they're going after him now because, we are at sort of a major war with China, and there's no other way to really look at the, at the tension that's building up. We're not having a hot war, but we're certainly having a cold war. And Bannon is there's no other way to say this. I'm just going to say it out loudly that Bannon really works for the Chinese. I mean, that seems to be where he gets, his instructions from. That's where he gets all his ideas from. And remember this guy, what's his name? Miles Guo. I can't remember his last name.
Guo Wingvi?
Yes,
or Miles Kwok.
Yeah, or he's got various actually names that he goes by. So he was reputedly, he came to America as the 73rd richest man in China and an anti-CCP activist who was going to overthrow the Chinese government from the United States. And it turns out that was all just bullshit.
Who apparently was still able to withdraw money from mainland China the way nobody does if they have crossed the party. So.
Yeah. No, this was all a cover story. It was a terrible cover story. He was accused of all sorts of crimes and whatever there. That's why he says he escaped. It was all a political witch hunt, he said, but it actually was not a witch hunt. It was just a cover story. He's an agent, clearly, of the Chinese state, and he has over the years amassed quite an empire here. And he works hand in hand with Steve Bannon. I mean, everything that Steve Bannon sort of does, I don't know how you say it. Is that how you say it? I don't know. He whatever he does, whatever they do, whatever Bannon does, Gui does as well. So here's a look at some of the massive empire that this guy has in the last few years amassed, and we won't go too deeply into it, but it's anyhow, I'll put this up on the Twitter feed later on. But this guy's got a massive network. So he's got all these weird YouTube channels. He's got Getter, the social media thing that Donald Trump tried to start a while ago before he did Truth Social. He's got and Bannon works with him when he does the War Room. So and as do Michael Flynn, as do Navarro, all these sort of characters have been around Donald Trump over the years. They all seem to have connections to Gui. So we're going to go there in a future episode. But I just want to make sure that everyone focuses on this idea today that Steve Bannon is facing these charges not just because he stole $1 million. He's facing these charges because the American government has had it with the Chinese screwing around in America. And that Steve Bannon is... now he's facing a second criminal charge here because, he's an operator. He's an asset. And there's people who listen to the War Room or whatever it is he calls his organization, his broadcast. You're listening to Chinese propaganda basically 24/7 being spouted at you. Sometimes Gui goes on there and shares his ideas. It's dangerous stuff, and that's why Steve Bannon needs to be put away, and that's why there is such an aggressive action against him. And it's about time.
Well, right. And it's interesting, we're making a major step here as a show, if I may just back up the context for the audience. A lot of what we talked about 3-4 years ago was glaring, as something that needed to be talked about. And that was the effect of Russia on democracies around the world. Now, given the role of the KGB in the 20th century, of course, why wouldn't you? China spent a lot of years very inwardly focused, or regionally focused. Surely they had an effect on Vietnam and Cambodia and places that were close, and no doubt had, through the United Front from the diaspora, they had effects on other countries too, but not as actively as the KGB, right? But that changed, and after 2016, where we really in America and elsewhere we had attacks on democracy from a number of corners, Russia was really the loudest about it. And there was a propaganda effort to focus us entirely on Russia and let off, well, Israel some, probably some Gulf states, but China. And of course, America has had a complicated relationship with China because we made the strategic decision in the 90s, if not before that, if not the Nixon administration, right, to strategically engage with China, not to shun them, despite their autocratic, authoritarian, utterly like genocidal practices. I mean, whether it's the Great Leap Forward and the agricultural revolution, which just starved millions of people to death, or the grotesquely brutal one-child policy. If you ever look into the details of how the Chinese Communist Party forced the bodies of Chinese women only producing one child, those are not stories for the faint of heart, and I don't see how they make for a very attractive strategic partner. But the story goes, between the 70s and 90s, we had to decide: are we going to compete strategically, and that means economically and militarily, or are we going to engage and make it more important to get along with American interests and to have a shared interest? And in the business of statecraft, which is why I got my master's degree in, we call that functionalism, doing things together. You're less likely to bomb each other. And there's a good,
It's true.
There's a whole list of reasons behind why you'd want to do that. And Bill Clinton really, took the lead in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the transformation of the Soviet Union as we now know it, to a mafia state. Clinton really, with our tech sector and our banks and everything else, we decided to engage with China. And I remember in about the year 2000 talking to executives as a strategic intelligence analyst, and they were talking about how much, that we called it Chinese mathematics. Do you know how much money there is in China? Do you know how big the market is? Why, if you only got 1% of the Chinese market, that's 1 billion people. We called that Chinese mathematics.
Yeah.
And I started asking questions such as, what do you think they will want in return? And the question a lot of very myopic, self-regarding American executives was, what do you mean? I'm like, well, do you think they're an empire that's been around for 2,000 plus years? What do you think they want? Well, do they want some of what we have? Well, don't you think they want their own thing? And so that was a difficult discussion. I asked tougher questions such as, do you think anyone on your staff should speak Mandarin if you're going to do this much business? And they're like, why would we do that? So in some senses, we had this coming. We
did. I mean, this was sort of naive to go into China without thinking they'd want something back. But, I don't think anyone was expecting the attack on democracy that, we sort of started seeing in 2016, but clearly was set in motion many, many years ago and many decades ago even. And, what we are finding in our investigation, and as you point out quite rightly, this has been something that we've seen in the background of the Russia investigation, of all these other investigations. China's always been this flashing red light in the background, if you will, that has been like, there's something going on here. We have to look at what China's doing. But we've been, over the summer and certainly over the last 6 years, amassing a pretty large amount of data, which really shows us that China and its operatives have played a significant role in every aspect of the attack on democracy. So we're not just talking about the coup of January the 6th, or the coup attempt of January 6th. We're talking about the rise of MAGA, the whole building of the MAGA movement from the Tea Party movement, Donald Trump's election, his presidency, the whole time during the presidency. Of course, the pandemic, the Chinese played a big role in that. Then into the big lie, the trade deal with China, which is a very skewed deal, and we'll discuss that in a later episode. And then finally, the attempted coup of January the 6th. I mean, that we see a lot of Chinese operatives there as well. So we're seeing a pretty long scale and large scale attack on America through its democratic institutions, through manipulation of the media and through social media manipulation that has gone on for years now and has really hurt American interests. And what we're going to be doing in this episode is breaking it down chapter by chapter by chapter to showing everybody that this is in fact a very sophisticated and very long-running attempt to destroy America and American democracy. and its aims are pretty clear to make America as extreme as possible, to make it as extremist as possible, to destroy the American institutions, whether it's the FBI or the Environment Protection Agency or you name it. They've certainly gone at it over the last few years. And also then to weaken our position around the world, which, of course, they've attempted to do. Now, they don't do this alone because, we're thinking, well, China hasn't really done any of these things directly. And in fact, what they've done is they've amassed all these other proxy nations. Russia, of course, is a big partner of China's. They share a lot of the strategic needs and aims of each other. But, it's a lot easier to have Russia do the attacking of the United States, and then China backs that up with some money to Russia. Same thing with Saudi Arabia, same thing with UAE, and the same thing with, frankly, a lot of individuals, a lot of businessmen, a lot of people who've made a lot of money in the last 20, 30 years of China are beholden to China. It's not that surprising.
That notion of China using proxy states, that's really embarrassing on a number of levels, because that technique is referred to by Sun Tzu in The Art of War, I believe, as a cat's paw. So imagine you stick a cat's paw on a stick with the sharp, the claws sticking out, and you put the stick out and you attack with that at a distance. Sun Tzu referred to that, I believe, as cat's paw. The use of a proxy in order to keep your hands clean while getting the damage in that you want. Do you know how many American businessmen prided themselves in the 90s on reading Sun Tzu? And you must know the enemy better than yourself. And the successful general wins before he shows up. The losing general shows up and fights. I mean, that was just so in vogue 30 years ago. Yeah. And then those same people got, turned their entire supply chain over to the Chinese Communist Party. Their financing, they didn't pay attention to that. And like, oh my God, we're being attacked by proxy states. Like, yes, didn't you read the Art of War, Sun Tzu? I did. Yeah, I thought everyone else did.
Yeah, he said, don't let the enemy know you're attacking them, right? You use a proxy nation to attack them. That's how he suggested you do these wars. So in fact, it's still their policy, I suspect, that they follow that doctrine. And so, there are a lot of American citizens here. We're not sort of taking the blame away from American citizens, but certainly the influence and the money is coming from China. But there are people like Rupert Murdoch, who shows up in tonight's episode, where, the owner of Fox News, this is the number one propaganda network in America, is feeding Americans a diet of propaganda that is obscene and terrible, from vaccines to the big lie. And he
married to a Chinese intelligence officer.
Yes. Boom. And also getting $100 million just last year from the Chinese. So, it's not like we have to look very far to see how they're influencing these people. And, and we'll show you tonight how Rupert, and over the next few weeks, how Rupert and Murdoch has been really long standing. It's been years of them doing this. So I'm hearing myself back to myself. I'm not sure why. You hear me? Am I hearing an echo?
No.
Okay, I'm hearing an echo.
You sound great, Bob.
Oh, okay, thank you. Maybe it's just the Chinese trying to make it hard for people to hear. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to start off. The next few episodes are about Wendy Dang and Ivanka Trump and their incredible 17-year friendship. 17 years, a long time to develop an asset. And then the next episode, we'll look at Rupert Murdoch and Jared Kushner, who've also had a very long-standing friendship. He's a total mentor to Jared Kushner. Isn't Jared lucky to have such a famous mentor? So we are going to do that through our little storytelling here. So I've not quite set this up the way I should. So give me 1 second while I do this. But if you could just wrap up your thoughts there on the shift that we're making this year in terms of our editorial policy. We really are taking a very different approach by filtering things through sort of a Chinese filter.
Well, I mean, it's important because it's been poorly understood. And especially the fact that it's not just the compromise of a few names that you've heard of, people like Jared Kushner, whose sister was selling condos. You get a free EB-5 visa. She was selling those to the Chinese while her brother was in the White House. They're the big names. But when you realize that the Chinese are very patient and they bribe individual businesses, individual small you know, governments, municipal governments and state governments, and just to pick a piece here, a piece there. Support one candidate for dog catcher, the next, for alderman or whatnot. And I think in your promo for this, Zev, you said you add a grain of sand, a grain of sand, a grain of sand, and eventually you get a beach. And I think the important thing to remember here is that this is just second nature for the Chinese. This is an empire that's been around for 2,500 years, that is no stranger to political warfare, no stranger to kinetic warfare, even though they haven't been in the game of kinetic warfare in the last 100 years too much. But this is just how they think, and I want to stress that this is out of respect and just an analytical sense that we're going into this. This is not this is not a boogeyman. This certainly has nothing to do with racism. In fact, there's a certain amount of respect here of like, look, this is the game that they've been playing. Russia played a different sort of game. Israel plays its own game. So do the Saudis. And America's self-regarding nature, it really does it a disservice. And it's just, if we're lucky, we've come through this very difficult chapter in American history fairly intact, where we still have a lot of work to do. But if we're going to, lead in the next century, if our own nation, if nobody else, we have to grow up essentially and start thinking about the world the way that more mature cultures do. And I think that's what we're going to try here.
Yeah. So let's start The Dragon's Tail. This is part 1. It was barely 3 months into the 45th presidency, and the Trumps hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping for an overnight stay at their Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago.
We wanted to make you feel at home.
It was neither winter nor protocol, and it seemed miles away, in tone at least, from the fire and brimstone of the campaign rhetoric that got Trump elected. Also highly unusual was the presidential granddaughter serenading the Chinese president and his soprano wife in Mandarin. Arabella Kushner, the eldest child of Jared and Ivanka Trump, was instantly thrust onto the world stage. It's oddly uncomfortable watching this 5-year-old being hauled before the two most powerful men in the universe in what was seen in China as a major political coup. Later that year, in November 2017, Trump was invited on a state visit to China and was given a rare visit of the 800-year-old Forbidden City. The trip was notable for this exchange between Xi and Trump about civilizations that outlasted them all.
And I guess the oldest culture, they say, is Egypt at 8,000.
Xi notes that yes, Egypt is older than China, but Chinese civilization is a unique, lasting culture in the world because it's been passed down through generations consistently for 5,000 years.
And people like us, we trace back to 5,000 years ago. Red hair, yellow skin. We call ourselves the inheritance people going down from
Yet there again, amid the historic setting, Trump handed Xi a tablet, and there's Arabella singing in Mandarin again. And as if that wasn't enough, the first granddaughter was singing again on video at a state dinner the following night in Beijing. Wonderful, they say. Now, I know everyone's thinking, what's wrong with Arabella singing in Mandarin? There's nothing wrong with Arabella. There's nothing wrong. Arabella, there's nothing wrong with you singing in Mandarin. Good for you that you can do it. But it is interesting that the granddaughter of the 45th president of the United States is so well versed in Mandarin, and that she knows all these really important Chinese songs, which ground her in sort of Confucius thinking and a bunch of other ideals. And it is surprising that he's a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, from New Jersey. Maybe he's got some mobbed up connections. She's
just maybe.
She's connected to the Italian mob, but you don't really see their connections to the Chinese in anywhere. So how did this happen that Arabella Kushner at 5 years old is so fluent in Mandarin that she's able to serenade the leader of the Chinese nation? And not once, not twice, but 3 times they play this. So yeah.
She have a Rosetta Stone, or
she has a Wendy Deng is who she has, and I'll explain how Wendy Deng connects to as Arabella's singing in Mandarin as we go through this next half hour. But it's fascinating to me that while Trump must have thought, well, this looks great, they love my granddaughter, don't they love my granddaughter? In the meantime, this is a real intelligence coup and a real diplomatic coup that they've got the granddaughter of their biggest adversary looking and sounding and talking exactly like every Mandarin child, or Chinese child. And that is why they played it 3 or 4 times. And that's why she became such a runaway success so quickly on social media in the United States, in China, is because that's a pretty big deal when you've got, you've got anchors that deep into the family.
Which networks was the Kushner's daughter so popular?
Chinese social networks. So, who knows? And she even made it into a foreign, one of their foreign, whatever they call the State Department there, whatever their version of the State Department was. She was even mentioned during one of those. She was mentioned there in a press conference. I mean, she sort of became, as Xi's wife was saying there at the end there, a messenger of Sino American relations. Now, who declared her that? Why did they declare her that? And the look of satisfaction on his face every time that he sees this is not because he loves Donald Trump's granddaughter. It's because they knew that they had success by compromising Kushner and Ivanka Trump household, and this is how they did it. So we know that Wendy Deng Murdoch is a really interesting figure. We mostly know her as a person who's formerly married to Rupert Murdoch. But she is, in fact, a very interesting person. She's had affairs with Vladimir Putin. She's supposedly had affairs with Tony Blair. I mean, those are 2 world leaders that are, I suspect, quite hard to get to. She's a New York socialite who hangs around with Nicole Kidman, Dan from Furstenberg. Like, she's really A-list crowd over there. And you might think she's a spy. I certainly think she might be a spy. And so does the Wall Street Journal, who, this is a big story that sort of alerted everyone to the possibility that Wendy Deng Murdoch might be a spy. And it was 2017, I think, or 2018, maybe it came out. What's the date on this thing? 2018. And it was a big story in the Wall Street Journal, which is a Murdoch paper, saying the United States warned Jared Kushner about Wendy Deng Murdoch being a spy and potentially influencing his family. Now, she'd been friends with both Jared and Ivanka for a very long time. Now, this was an interesting project. They were building some sort of, panda vivarium. I don't know how you say the term, but they're building some sort of panda housing at nearby the White House. And it was a Chinese initiative. Do you know much about this project? You might know more than I do. I don't know. There's part of this project involved a 30-foot tower or something like that.
Yeah, they were going to build a garden, arboretum, whatever. It was going.
Arboretum? Is that how you say it?
Whatever.
No, I'm curious.
They were doing it was going to look like a park or a garden, and it was going to have a 30-foot tower that that looked down at the White House and the Pentagon, and it could exchange, it could pick up and send signals. So we don't let you do that in DC.
And she was apparently out there lobbying for this stuff, and and doing quite a bang up job of getting people to donate and all of that. But they decided no, they shouldn't let that through, and then they mentioned it to Jared and Ivanka.
To do the A/B comparison between some of our past shows and today, like, everybody out there has probably seen the picture of Vladimir Putin and Trump in Helsinki in 2018, where 5'6" in heels Putin is with 6'3" Donald Trump, and Trump is slouching over and somehow looks shorter than Putin, and he looks like a beaten dog. And what a diplomatic coup. But the fact is, as soon as Trump was in there, he owed everybody a little something. Trump already owed the Bank of China, like Rupert Murdoch does now. Murdoch got a new $100 million loan, but Trump owed a 9-digit figure to the Bank of China when he walked in the White House that day. Which if you were going for a clearance for a regular job that needed that kind of access to classified intelligence, you would not get the job because you owe $200 million to the Bank of China. Can't do it. I mean, they get on you if you like scratchers tickets and lotto too much. So $200 million to the Bank of China, totally out. But Trump had that. Everybody that had something over Trump, whether it was Bibi Netanyahu or the Saudis or whoever, they went to cash in with Trump because he was weak and he had a weak team around him that was equally, owned by different factors. But anyhow, one of the first things the Chinese did when Trump got in was try and build a signals intelligence facility overlooking the White House, which our security services shut down, irrespective of what Kushner tried to pull. But that's how aggressive this was, and that's an insanely that's an incredibly aggressive move. And they tried it, and it's not that long ago. It was 5+ years ago, and it was in the newspaper,
and it was on the radio. Here's what Here and Now at NPR reported on that day about the story. It's a little long, but it's worth our time. This is how they reported the story.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting today that U.S. counterintelligence officials warned President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner that Wendy Deng Murdoch might be using her friendship with Kushner and Ivanka Trump to promote the interests of the Chinese government. Murdoch is the ex-wife of News Corp CEO Rupert Murdoch and has been friends with Ivanka Trump for more than 12 years. Joining us now is NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik. Hi, David.
Hey, Jeremy.
And let's start with our characters here. Wendy Deng Murdoch, she and Rupert Murdoch were married from 1999 to 2013. Then they divorced. What more should we know about her?
Well, she's, for one thing, she was born in China. She got to know Murdoch as a very young staffer at one of his Chinese properties, inveigled her way into ask questions when he was touring there, became quickly an interpreter and tour guide, and suddenly popped up as his consort even before his second marriage was entirely through. She was an influential figure on Murdoch in a lot of ways, moderating his politics, presenting a public face of News Corp and Fox's interests in China, and a very important one, as the Chinese market is a very closed one. So she, for many years, until their clearly irrevocable split, among other things, over her infidelities alleged by Murdoch, she was an important figure for him, and particularly as it pertains to China.
And what is her relationship with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner?
Well, Jared Kushner, as people may recall, is the son of a somewhat disgraced New Jersey real estate magnate. He made his big push in the early 2000s, first decade of 2000, into New York City by making a splashy acquisition here in real estate, but also buying the New York Observer. Rupert Murdoch served as something of a mentor for him and a bit of a father figure for him, squiring him around and introducing him and making him in some ways a known figure in media circles as well as establishment circles in New York. Wendy Deng served much the same purpose for Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner's girlfriend, and helped to smooth out some of the wrinkles in their relationship, encouraging them to work out their problems as they work toward what has been, a marriage for some years now. She pops up a lot in Ivanka Trump's Instagram feed. They appear on photographs at the inauguration last year for Trump, but also on vacations together.
All right. So according to the Wall Street Journal, the warning to Jared Kushner about Wendy Deng was part of an effort by national security officials to explain to Kushner that he needed to be careful when dealing with people who have interests that might conflict with those of the U.S. government. What kind of pro-China interests do we know that Wendy Deng had?
Well, the story is very specific. It involves a planned $100 million project. It would be a Chinese garden at the National Arboretum, as I believe it's pronounced. This was considered a national security risk, according to the Journal's account, because it's actually on a pretty high patch of land. They were planning a 70-foot tall white tower that, one could imagine they could use for intercepting signals as a form of intelligence.
And that didn't happen, that project?
It never happened.
So, what about Kushner's relationship with China, or Kushner's role in U.S.-China relations? He was the one who set up the meeting between President Trump and the Chinese president at Mar-a-Lago last April. He went with Trump to Beijing in November. What evidence do we have that Wendi Deng did use her friendship with Kushner and Ivanka Trump to try to influence policy?
I don't know that that was the case. Certainly, she's been a frequent companion of Ivanka Trump in particular, and is a confidant of the Kushners. And she has met with senior Chinese officials, including at the time the Chinese premier some years ago. So she is certainly familiar with that world. I will say, that News Corp executives used to joke among themselves, what if Wendi is somehow a Chinese asset? What if she's a spy? And I think it was sort of the sniping that sometimes occurs about the big boss's spouse in this company or that company. Roger Ailes used to have the late chairman of Fox used to claim that it was true, but he was a very conspiratorial-minded guy. After his split from Wendi Deng Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch used to suggest the same thing.
So that's interesting. I thought that last little bit there, where Roger Ailes used to believe that that Wendi Deng was a spy while she was married to Rupert Murdoch, her boss at Fox News, and then Rupert Murdoch himself used to say that she was a Chinese spy afterwards. I mean, that to me is kind of news. I didn't know that before, although I'm sure people did. But I find that fascinating.
I mean, so, I worked with people who thought the ocean might be moist. I've known some people who've had a weird conspiracy theory that salt was salty, and others believe that Wendi Deng is a Chinese spy.
Yeah, but she is.
It's exotic here on Narrative, folks.
Yeah.
We deal in the occult.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me that they knew inside, they were they were getting all the money from China. They knew that she was married to he was married to a Chinese spy. She got him all these contracts that he needed in Asia. She got him access to all these people. She got him access to the leadership in China. So of course she's a spy. Of course she is. And,
of course she's a spy.
Yeah.
Anybody, look, I don't know if this comes up on Tinder or Hinge or whatever apps are out there, but if anybody has a dating past of more than 3 heads of state,
spy.
They're a spy.
Yeah.
Just say they're a spy.
Yeah, they're a spy.
And I love that. I love the middle class American hand wringing about, well, there was infidelities. It's like, these are, when you're talking about monarchs and CEOs and spies and nation states, nobody cares where your pee-pee parts go. Yeah. This is just part of spy stuff and nation state tradecraft.
Absolutely. A couple of interesting things about Wendi Deng. We're going to run out of time, but I got to tell you a couple of things. Guess what her real name is?
Not Wendi?
Well, it's actually Deng Wengi, which actually means cultural revolution.
That's
in China, in Chinese, in Mandarin. And she's also, as you know, a former, her parents were Communist Party leaders in the town that she was.
Her dad ran a factory, I believe. Yeah,
an engineering factory. And, despite the fact that she says they were raised really poor, I don't think they were raised that poor. I think they were just kind of high up in the ranks of the Communist Party in China. She found her way to the United States, by the way, by having an affair with a guy and then getting him to divorce his wife, and then marrying him just so she can get a green card with just the amount of time that she needed to get a green card. So she's not a lovely person. She's purely transactional. That's what spies do. But we know that's what spies do. So in 2005, Wendi meets Ivanka, and as she describes it, she meets Ivanka because they were neighbors. We just met because, hey, what does it say here? We met as neighbors in New York City and quickly became close. As modern working moms, we have as many of the same challenges and joys, and she's become a trusted counsel in my life. Not only that, at one point, Ivanka was also the trust manager for her daughters, Rupert Murdoch's daughters, trust fund. So they became really, really close. And, the fact that she's claiming...
Wait, hold on. Trust fund, what? What was that again?
The Murdoch daughters have a trust fund of some sort. And at some point, Ivanka was one of the managers of that fund. Until that's how close they were. We're talking like, this is
very close.
Very, very close family friend. Yeah. And, when she won the Time 100, or when she was on the Time 100, Ivanka Trump asked Wendi Murdoch to write her this nice little narrative about how they met and all of that 12 years ago. There they are in Croatia in August of 2016 on vacation. They're believed to have rendezvoused with the Rybolovlev yacht as well. And it's not only that, it's clear that some people believe, at least People magazine believes, that Wendy introduced Ivanka to Jared, that they're in fact the reason they are together. And then they both agree, and everyone sort of knows that she brought them back together when they broke up because Jared's family was upset that she wasn't Jewish. In fact, Jared writes about this in his latest memoir, where he talks about months in, Kushner, an observant Jew, broke up with her because of their religious differences. This is from Vogue, Vanity Fair's write-up about his book. She told him it was the worst decision of his life, until Wendy Murdoch surreptitiously invited them both on the Murdoch's yacht for a weekend to get them back together. He also witnessed Rupert Murdoch strike a deal to buy the Dow Jones, yada, yada, yada. Also, there were Bono, Billy Joel, and Bob Geldof serenading them. And so this is basically, they invite Ivanka to the yacht, and then 3 days later, Jared shows up and they get back together. And so,
hold on, that last line is really good. Murdoch, Kushner writes, whispered that they were the two least talented people there. Hashtag correct. I mean, come on, you got.
So
yeah. You're in the same room with Bono and Billy Joel, and you're on the bottom list of talent. I mean,
but who has an interest in two people to such an extent that they would go and over a 20-year period spend their time introducing them, developing a relationship for them, building businesses for them, then bringing them back together when they break up on yachts, expensive yachts in the middle of these things are not necessarily cheap trips. And who else?
So you got Ivanka, whose family fronted the Genovese crime family in New York that then got ruled by the Russians. And then you have Kushner, who's definitely on the Israeli side of things. And a Jersey guy, that's a different territory. So, man, putting those two, gosh, it's just like royal marriages in other countries where you're marrying territories together and, forming alliances. So
marriage made in mob heaven. Yeah. So, and here they
money
are.
Money and power, man.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah, they are in 2010 as the godparents of the two daughters. You see there's a bunch of people in the background that you recognize a lot of the faces from, TV and film. Tony Blair, by the way, was also there apparently, but not pictured here because apparently he was having an affair with Wendy. Yes, a little strange to put him in the photo. But they were hanging out with rich and famous people. This is, by the way, they baptized the girls as one does on the River Jordan, where Jesus was apparently baptized because that's what you do, I guess.
Who got baptized?
Their daughters, Rupert and Wendy's daughters, baptized, and because they have the money to do that. But they brought Wendy and Ivanka and Jared along. So I'm just saying that the entire thing smells to me like a procurement of an asset. I don't know what the exact term would be in mob speak, but basically over a 20-year period, we have seen these two people being captured by Wendy in terms of Ivanka. And in the next episode, we'll hear how Rupert did it for Jared. And this was a concerted effort. This was not something they did as a occasional thing. This was something they did over 20 years to try and win the allegiance of these two people, who then end up being the most important people in the White House. And before I forget, I should tell you how the granddaughter, Arabella, learned to speak Mandarin. Wendy Dang's nanny, her name is Gigi, is the teacher of Arabella's Mandarin, because that's who she gave to Ivanka and Jared to help them with raising the kids. In New York City, you don't give up a good nanny. You just don't give up a good nanny. I mean, it's just like doesn't happen. But Wendy Dang gave up her very, very amazing nanny to be the raiser of Ivanka and Jared's kids. And guess what? She's fluent in Mandarin and happens to be a Chinese national and goes by the name of Gigi.
So wait a minute, was that during Kushner's time in the White House?
Oh, they still today. I don't know if she's still there today, but she might still be there. Certainly in 2020, she was still the nanny for the kids. So
yes.
Yeah.
So Jared and Ivanka had a Chinese national in their home while Jared was working all these diplomatic gigs and an advisor and
trade deal with China,
also in the White House,
pandemic, and all those things.
And so they had a Chinese national in there listening all the time and teaching their daughter Chinese culture and language.
Yeah, God knows how many listening devices she dropped into the house there, right? I mean, the whole place must have been bugged to death.
Or into blazers
Yeah.
and skirts and
Yeah.
handbags.
So you got
Just
a
a
best
thought.
friend who's a spy. You probably have a nanny who's a spy, and a daughter who's basically an asset now for the Chinese state, going forward. Because hey, look how good they are.
5.
She's
She's
fine.
singing some songs.
Yeah.
I mean,
She'll be fine. But the point is that they were really celebrating the success of their incredible intelligence operation when they were playing back those videotapes. I mean,
that's for certain.
They were like, "Oh, look at it! We scored a huge goal here. This is."
I'm not gonna put this on little Arabella. I think her performance is awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool. My kids might have been able to sing "Wheels on the Bus," but they were not lobbyists for the automotive industry in any way. However, were the Chinese celebrating that they've got America, and they got the granddaughter of a president, and that whole generational thing and reverence for older people in the family? That's huge in a Confucian society. So having somebody else's grandkid sing in your culture's language, woo, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Put that in context of, like, Zeb, you remember this stupid stuff during the Winter Olympics, and they had Mike Pence out doing photo op. First of all, you got Donald Trump shaking hands with Kim Jong-un, which normally would never stoop. This country wouldn't stoop to that regime's level. Yeah, and of course we did, which is a huge coup for China and Russia. And then they have Mike Pence sitting with the sister of Kim Jong-un. Mm-hmm. And in all the photos, she's kind of taller than him. That was a coup. There were so many diplomatic, America humiliating coups that were pulled off during the pendency of Trump's thing. And this is a very intense one. And it's a very special one. And when you say that it went viral on Chinese media, that doesn't surprise me at all. It was a huge success, and we didn't get the joke until just now.
Yeah. Basically now it's a Washington Post correspondent who actually mentioned it in a book 2 years ago, but it just didn't get anywhere. The story never got anywhere. That the maid, the nanny in the Kushner's household was the exact spy that they needed to have in place as he was negotiating the trade agreement with China. He was the guy negotiating the trade agreement with China. So, because he's got an in the Chinese government, and so is Navarro, another one of their Chinese assets, and Bannon. So this is the point of this long investigation that we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. China's everywhere, and we're going to keep picking away and figuring out exactly where they are in all these big events that have led us to, it's still a very huge crisis. And if you think they're letting down, they're not. They have built up their presence. They are continuing, in fact, increasing their presence, and their intelligence assault, both the Russians and the Chinese, on America this year is greater than it's ever been. So they're not stopping. We might have caught up now to understanding who's who and who's what, but they're not stopping. They're continuing their assault on America.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is the dynamics changed though, right? Because this is all Again, we weren't having this discussion. We were very busy with the Mueller report, mm-hmm. which is very important, and it is I think we haven't even seen all of its importance yet. So I'm not denigrating it in any way, but America had so much to wake up from. We're just now getting around to the influence of China. Yeah, and
so important because the influence of China is the one thing MAGA worries about. I'll close at this point. The one thing MAGA worries about the most is the fact that America could turn into communist China. That's the big fear that MAGA has, right? That's why MAGA is MAGA, is they don't want to turn, they don't want the Democrats turning America into communist China. Meanwhile, it's communist China that's enabling the whole MAGA movement. And so, that little thing needs to be woken up to. And, we certainly are not going to be able to wake up the MAGA movement to that. But if everyone could start thinking about things in those terms, we'll realize that MAGA's been a giant snow job. And people need to wake up to that fact, because we'll lose America if we don't. And that's basically the truth.
Well, this is, I think people are going to start to realize that the, January 6th was not about white nationalism. Mm-hmm. Make America Great Again was not really about Americans. America First was not funded or managed by America as much as it was other folks. And that of all the nations that had something to gain from that, it's China most of all, because Israel can play all sides. And as long as they, as long as it gets what it wants, can do pretty well. Russia has some, Russia's very confused. Look at how it's gone in Ukraine. But, as long as they expand their borders or feel good about themselves, if they break America, alongside that, or I don't know, rip off some money from our Medicare, they're good. But China has the most ambitious plans of all, and they can think out 100 or 200 years. And in fact, there have been documents written by Chinese People's Liberation Army generals about releasing bioweapons and just taking the farmland in America and Canada to feed its own people.
Yeah, they're running out of food. They don't have enough food to feed their people. They don't, and that's who has food. Who has land? We have land. America and Canada has land. That's where it is. So that's why they've been buying up all this farmland in these blood red states and figuring out the implications of that. Well, that's our job this year, isn't it, Zev? We're going to help everyone get. Yeah, everyone gets aware of this. So that's our job with the Dragon's Tail. And we want to thank you for watching tonight. The podcast, which comes out next Monday, is going to be something a little different than before. Normally, we've just given you this whole live show as a podcast. We're going to edit it down so it's a little bit more streamlined for your listening pleasure and not quite an hour and 10 minutes long, because we enjoy talking to each other, Eric. We do. We can't stop. So the live show continues to be the full length version of our banter, but the podcast, which comes out next Monday on Apple Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts, will be available on a shorter format. And we should thank all the patrons who have made tonight possible. Without you, this season of Narrative would simply not have been made possible. Thank you very much for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. And we need you to join in on the Patreon program. So please go to patreon.com/narrative. Almost forgot that. Patreon.com/narrative and help support Narrative going forward. Because it's where truth lives. Have a good night, everybody.
One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narrative, where truth lives.